Hey everyone, it's Dr. Cervantes. I want to give you a little bit of guidance as we prepare for your Module 1 exam over chapters 16 through 20. I'm not going to necessarily give you every question, of course, but what I wanted to give you was an idea of what you should be studying. So give you some direction as you study over the next week. So let's start with chapter 16. Chapter 16, of course, looks at industrialization in the United States, the rapid changes that occur in the U.S. economy in the post-Civil War era. We're pretty used to change here in the 21st century. We kind of see it as just part of everyday life. And while change is something that is always present, change does occur more rapidly for post-Civil War Americans as the economy transforms in ways that no one ever could have really predicted. So let's take a look at what you want to look at in chapter 6. First off, one of the things you should be looking at are some of the methods of growth, especially within big business. You will notice that entrepreneurs, captains of industry, if you will, like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, some of them are pretty good at vertical and horizontal integration. So be familiar with those types of methods of growth. You will definitely want to be familiar with the concept of trusts and how that enabled rapid corporate growth. And last but not least, from that chapter, I really want you to be familiar with the labor unions and their goals. You'll read about organizations like the American Federation of Labor, the Knights of Labor, and so be familiar with what their methods were of organizing and what kind of goals they had. Along the way, pay attention to some of the clashes that do occur between labor and management or labor and government. Good examples would be things like the Haymarket Square affair or the Homestead strike in 1892 at Carnegie's steel mills outside of Pittsburgh. Transitioning over to chapter 17, you'll notice in that chapter that not the whole nation is not necessarily experiencing industrialization at the same rate or at the same level. Much of that industrialization you read about in chapter 16 is occurring in the northern section of the country, to be more exact, in the Northeast and the Midwest. Think kind of like Chicago to Boston and everywhere in between. The rest of the country is not necessarily unfamiliar with industrialization, but again, it's not occurring in the same way. What you are seeing in chapter 17 is that the South has its own special set of experiences, as does the West. For the purposes of this exam, you'll want to pay a little bit more attention to the South than the West. Little Bird told me that there might be a few more questions based on the South than the West. Anyway, as we look at chapter 17, you will of course want to take note of the economy of the New South. There is that movement to transform the Southern economy. There is that New South idea of introducing industrialization and urbanization to the South in the post-Civil War era, just as they are experiencing in the North. So you do want to look at the examples of some of that industrialization that the South is experiencing. Of course, however, the South's experience in the late 19th century is not overwhelmingly one of industrialization and urbanization. Instead, much of the South remains an incredibly agricultural region, and cotton becomes more dominant than it ever had been in the years before the Civil War. So I want you to pay attention to agriculture in the New South, specifically looking at the crop lien system and the associated problems with it, and the plight of sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and the like. Something that you'll notice is something that was a problem for both poor Southern whites and blacks. Of course, another thing that made the South different from some of the rest of the country is the level of racial discrimination. There is racial discrimination across the United States in the late 19th century, but in the South it takes a much more legalized look as we see efforts to legalize segregation as well as efforts to disfranchise black voters. So look at how those are accomplished. What are some of the important rulings that open the door for segregation in the South? What are some examples of states disfranchising black voters, and what kinds of methods are used to disfranchise black voters? Moving out to the West, there are a couple things you want to look at as you look at the West here in this chapter. You will want to look at farming in the West, and specifically some of the problems associated with farming, some of the obstacles, if you will, to farming in that region. And of course, that West is not an empty, vacant region when many white settlers move out there. So you have Indians living out there. And of course, there, as you see in your chapter, there are a number of wars fought between the United States and the Plains Indians. Wars which ultimately result in the conquest of the West and the removal of Indians to reservations. Along that note, look at the Dawes Severalty Act and the role that it played in trying to refashion, reshape Indian society on the reservations. Chapter 18 looks at the Gilded Age, politics and society in this era. Again, broadly looking at 1865 to 1900, which had been nicknamed the Gilded Age. So alongside all of these economic and social transformations that you've looked at in the previous two chapters, Chapter 18 digs deeper to look at political movements as well as how American society is at the time. You'll want to look at the political issues of the day, especially issues that relate to the money supply, debate over the gold standard versus incorporating silver into the money supply. You'll want to look at kind of the plight of the farmers and how many farmers felt they were being left behind in the late 19th century, and look at how they are trying to organize some kind of political pushback against the powers that be, if you will. Of course, one of the things that helps transform the United States in the late 19th century is immigration. Obviously, immigration is something that has always been occurring in the history of the United States. The United States is created by people migrating from Europe and establishing a new society for themselves in North America. So the story of the United States is in many ways a story of people immigrating from various parts of the world. But what we see going on in the late 19th century is that immigration is accelerated, and you begin to see immigrants coming from other parts of Europe, from where there had not been immigrants really coming before. So I want you to look at some of those broader immigration trends, and pay special note as well to how this is received by Americans who are already here. Last but not least, take note of life in the cities and how that is changing. The United States is urbanizing in the late 19th century, and so you have a population that, in the past had been primarily used to living in small towns and on farms. But now more and more Americans are moving into the cities, and that leads to new patterns of life, new social patterns, new opportunities for leisure. So pay a little bit of attention to life in the cities and how that's changing here in the late 19th century. Chapter 19 looks at the idea of American expansion and imperialism. The United States building an empire for itself in the late 19th century, suddenly finding itself becoming a world power, something that Americans would not have really thought of a century before. So here, what I want you to look at are things like the idea of imperialism, especially individuals like Alfred Thayer Mahan and the role they play in promoting this idea of American expansion, of promoting American power abroad. Look at concepts like social Darwinism and see what role those concepts played in pushing for this idea of conquering an empire. You'll want to know about some examples of expansion. For example, Hawaii and Alaska, how those were acquired, and kind of what impact that had on the United States becoming gradually a world power here in the late 19th century. One of the major moments that is covered in chapter 19 is the Spanish American War. A very short war, as you've seen, as Secretary of State John Hay remarked. In his eyes, it was a, quote, splendid little war. While it was a very short war, lasting just a few months, it did have some major consequences. So look at those consequences of the Spanish-American War in form of territorial acquisition, the position it put the United States in to become more of a world power as we enter the 20th century, things like that. And then last but not least, you'll want to look at President Taft's diplomacy, specifically dollar diplomacy. So that should give you some help as you prepare for chapter 19. Last but not least, the very last chapter for Module 1 exam is over progressivism. This new approach to politics at all levels. As the United States is wrestling with the consequences of industrialization and urbanization and everything that accompanies that, we see a lot of Americans changing their expectations of government at the federal, state, and local level. So what we're going to see is that in the late 19th, early 20th century, major transformations in government and expectations of government. And the dominant way of thinking is going to be something called progressivism. So as we look at progressivism, you'll notice early in the chapter there's some discussion of kind of the roots of progressive activism and progressive thought. And you'll notice that there's something of a connection between the populists, those farmers who became more politically active in the late 19th century, and the progressive movement. So be sure and study that connection between populism and progressivism. Another, in this case, group that helps create the environment in which progressivism can take root is a group of journalists that are known as muckrakers. They're not an organized group in any way, shape, or form, but this is just the name given to investigative journalists, if you will, who see it as their job to expose social and political problems. So know who some muckrakers are, as well as what they were trying to accomplish and how that connected to creating an environment ripe for the progressive movement. The social gospel, another example of something that helps give rise to the progressive era in the 20th century. I want you to look at examples of the social gospel in action, organizations that might have been created to try to, in a sense, bring the kingdom of God to earth by bettering social environment. And then last but not least, you definitely want to be aware of some examples of progressivism at the presidential level. Theodore Roosevelt is broadly seen as the first progressive president, so there's a lot of progressive policies associated with his administration, and same can be said for Woodrow Wilson. These are two of the most important presidents of the 20th century, and a lot of their administration's accomplishments are very much connected to the idea of progressivism. So look for examples of Roosevelt and Wilson acting in progressive manners, and examples of their administrations promoting a progressive vision, if you will. Again, like I said, these aren't necessarily all of the questions for your Module 1 exam, but if you study these major points, and if you've read through those several chapters already, which hopefully you have as you've been taking quizzes over them, you will be in very good shape as you sit down to complete your Module 1 exam. Good luck, and I'll be speaking with you for your next exam review.